Pericles and Athens by A.R. Byrne. The Golden Age of Greece, seen through the life of her leading statesmen. Let's see if we can finish chapter 7 in this program. I just lost my place, sorry. Tolmides, however, called for volunteers and got them without difficulty. Most adventurous young men of the landowning classes. Cleinias was one of the senior men among them, and perhaps a general. There were also allied contingents, probably from the faithful Plataea and from other Boeotian cities, in alliance with Athens. Just how unreliable by now local allies were, Tolmides did not appreciate. What does not appear is why Tolmides did not at least take a larger force. It was winter, that is to say, late autumn, with snow beginning to fall on the high mountains and rain in the lowlands, a season which campaigning was extremely unpopular with Greek citizen troops, but 1,000 armored men was very few. It was not unlikely that a considerable number of Athenian troops was still scattered over the empire, seeing to the collecting of tribute under Cleinias's decree. Well, if it's the right thing to do ethically, or if you're patriotic and you think this is what's going to benefit your country, the difficult times of heat and cold are the more meritorious, the more, brave sort of times to go out. Tolmides and his men took Chaeronea and sold the prisoners as slaves, a severe measure of reprisal. But Orchomenos, on its long steep-sided spur, with the castle at its top, was too much for him earlier to blockade or storm. He garrisoned Chaeronea and started to lead his army home between Lake Capais and Mount Helicon. Now, the whole reason for even the worst of criminals being sent to prison, it's really slavery. They've sold us on this punishment or debts of society or something like this. It's really a slavery system, and it's become more popular with the corporatization of the prisons in America and elsewhere too. But America leads the world, because it's corporatized. I do not believe at all in slavery for, wars to capture slaves is something cursed in the eyes of God. The narratives attached to texts such as this would agree with that. Not all faiths have that philosophy. Obviously, there are so-called gods. These the Athenians, they didn't exactly discourage this, obviously. Mount Helicon is a spreading forested region, much cloven owing to the lie of geological strata, by parallel glens running east and west, an insidious mountain offering possibilities of concealed movement that have repeatedly been found useful by modern guerrillas. By such a route, the exiles and their loyal supporters now got ahead of Tolmides and lay in wait for him at Chaeronea, where a south to north valley opens into the plain. Some local shepherd or goatherd could have warned Tolmides of its danger, but Athens had taken no trouble to cultivate the people among her continental allies. She now paid the penalty. On the road from Lebedaia to Haliartos, the Athens fell upon Tolmides, marching columns. The Athenian allies leave no mark in history. Probably they dissolved without striking a blow. Tolmides, Cleinias, and many others fell fighting, and more than half the Athenians, broken and hemmed in, were forced to surrender. The Boeotian nationalists thus made an invaluable haul of well-born Athenian hostages, and to secure their release, the assembly abandoned all its claims to Caesarea Ainti in Boeotia. Every city except Plataea broke off its alliance with Athens, and Thebes resumed her normal position as managing director in the Boeotian League. Constitutions were revised in an oligarchic sense. In Athenian parlance, the people were enslaved, and no more was heard of democracy in Boeotia so long as Athens remained the leading power in Greece. Pericles might at least hope, however, to have gained Boeotia's benevolent neutrality instead of her unwilling submission, and this hope for a time was justified. It was well for Athens, for the 5 years' truce with Sparta was coming to an end, and without even waiting for the Spartans to march, the movement of rebellion now spread to Euboea. Tribute list number 9 shows that the Euboeans paid their quota. In the spring of 446, the rebellion probably followed as soon as the islanders had thus got rid of the armed tribute collecting expeditions, which Athens often sent out where difficulties were expected. The protagonist of victorious action this time was Pericles himself. Euboea was no mainland ally, but an essential part of the Delian League. A strong force under Pericles was ordered to Euboea, while 3 regiments under Andokides covered Megara, holding the passes at Geronaia against any threat from the Peloponnese. But scarcely had Pericles crossed the water from which he was recalled by far worse news. The Peloponnesians were marching, and Megara had revolted with help from Corinth, Epidaurus, and Sicyon, massacring her Athenian garrison and cutting communications with Athens in the rear of Andokides' army. With great difficulty and not without fighting, Andokides' 3 regiments made their way back, pulling in first to Bagae on the west coast, where they left a garrison, and then by mule tracks and sheep tracks to Agasthena on the extreme northeast corner of the Gulf, and probably over the high shoulder of Kithaeron to Plataea. Hence, through Boeotia, they made their way back to Athens. Their guide in this adventure was one Pathion, a Megarian woodcutter, and evidently a stout democrat, who killed 7 men with his own hand and brought honor to Andokides with 2,000 men. He lived the rest of his life at Athens, where his pleasantly illiterate epitaph, perhaps his own composition, gives us these details of his and Andokides' adventures. Now, the draconian law system, which was to make its, I think it was before, was it before all this or whatever? One of the things when you create a sort of a war state, as it's can be called, is the soldiers are more likely to come back and kill people in the country. And what do you do with that? Probably executing them is the best idea. I mean, even in terms of the safety of the attempts to, I don't know, enslave them or something. But the thing I like about the thing that's interesting about the draconian losses, Dracon was he, the 4-sided figures, which made sense why it became one of the Platonic solids, right? Among those who took part in this adventure was in all probability Socrates, as a 24-year-old soldier in the Antiochus regiment. The united army stood before Athens, but it was terribly outnumbered by the great masses of spearmen who now poured into Attica. It was 507 all over again, the Peloponnesians in front and a hostile Euboea unopposed in the rear. Though Boeotia was neutral now, but on the other hand there was no hope this time for friendly Corinth to take the lead in upsetting Sparta's designs, And yet, to everybody's amazement, exactly the same thing happened again. The Peloponnesians' army reached Eleusis and came on almost to the Aigaleas ridge, and there they halted, and without fighting turned about and went home. What had happened behind the scenes was, of course, most secret, but few people had any doubt about it, least of all the government of Sparta. The young king Pleistoanax, who had been in titular command of the expedition, was brought to trial on his return. Such things could be done at Sparta, and sentenced to a heavy fine, and went into exile. Simultaneously, his chief of staff, the great soldier Cleanidas, fled for fear of arrest. The Spartans tried him in his absence and condemned him to death. He was the father of that Gylippus who was 30 years later to overthrow the Athenians in Sicily, and, at last, to be condemned for corruption in his turn. Pericles kept his own counsel. Besides, he was busy with 50 ships and 5,000 armored men, leaving fully half the first-line army this time to guard against other threats. He crossed again to Euboea, and in probability his most brilliant campaign crushed the rebellion in one summer. A new Cleuruca of 1,000 families was planted at Araos in the territory of Hestiaea in the north of the island, through which Athens could control the communications between Euboea and the northern mainland, and the whole population of Hestiaea was driven out. This was justified by Pericles as reprisal, because during the rebellion they had massacred the crew of an Athenian ship. Okay, that's pretty reasonable response to that. The other Euboean cities were treated gently. Their tribute was not raised, and they kept control of their internal affairs, Athens retaining, as was now usual, certain overriding powers, especially the function of the Athenian juries as a court of appeal. The Euboeans enjoyed even the right of intermarriage with Athenians, but it was too late. For all the liberality of the settlement, a Periclean settlement, Athens never hereafter ceased to feel nervous about Euboea. 35 years later, in Athens' dark hour, the islanders took the first opportunity to revolt successfully. We have the text of the decree providing for the ratification of the treaty with Chalkis. The people of Chalkis, is it Chalkis, are secured against the fate of Hestiaea, but they formally swear allegiance to the people of Athens alone. We have traveled a long way since Erythrae swore allegiance to the people of Athens and the allies. It remained to settle with Sparta that Athens should agree to concessions with their main forces undefeated is unparalleled in Athenian history. Not to make concessions at this juncture would have been to invite disaster. Yet for the fact that on this occasion they were made, credit is probably due to Pericles, Anocidas, and the veteran Callias, now performing his last service to Athens, were among the envoys sent to Sparta. And in that winter, 446 to 445, a 30 years' peace was at last signed. Athens gave up Nisaea and Pagae, all ports of the Megara, and withdrew from the Peloponnese, abandoning Troezen and Achaia, though not her entente with Argos, but she kept her Aegean empire, including Aegina, subject to some stipulations about autonomy, internal home rule. She also kept Naupactos. It was a triumph for the Periclean policy a triumph not least over the Athenian assembly, for the policy of holding fast to the maritime empire, eschewing risky adventures, and conserving above all the precious resources of Athenian manpower. At the end of that year, Pericles had an item in his accounts which he did not wish to discuss. In the end, he wrote down, to necessary expenditure, 10 talents, and left it to that. The people would scarcely have taken such treatment from anyone else, but they took it from Pericles. Think of that. They're like 50-kilo things. It's like a person's weight worth of gold or silver or whatever they were collecting. Indeed, according to one account, a secret vote became necessary after this, where Pericles lived, a regular item. Necessary expenditure became a standard quotation at Athens, and remained a popular joke for at least 40 years. Nowadays, it's, okay, government spending's up to 8% of the taxes. I mean, as far as what governments should be, the types of things government should spend on. And the rest of it's 60% entitlement, 22% conditioned and indirect welfare for the rich. We can do better as a country. But, this is where the seeds get sown. It would scarcely have done to write down the bribery of one Spartan king and his chief of staff. But Pericles certain appears to have bought them cheap. What he had probably done, in fact, was to persuade them in earnest that he intended to sue for peace, offering concessions, which was true. Then he could offer his 10 talents as a secret douture. Is that how you say it? I think it's, is it French? Douture? I don't know. For calling off their army without further devastations. What the two Spartans had not appreciated was that, in the time thus gained, Pericles could secure the one vital point, Euboea. As Pericles said of one of his secret payments, what I bought was not peace, but time. So Pericles had his peace, with the tribute. Now there would be the time and money for the great efflorescence of the Athenian buildings, sculpting, and music that was nearest his heart. The year 445 is a notable date in history, for the 30 years' peace, though it lasted less than 15, gave respite, in which those buildings were completed, which spring to the mind's eye of every man who hears the name of Athens. And you know what those buildings are, don't you? It was not that the treaty was greeted anywhere with acclamation at that time. A trying war had ended in a compromised peace. There was relief, perhaps, but few cities were without some cause for dissatisfaction. Many had cause for shame. Remember the series of Buddhism that I just did. Dissatisfaction is the word for dukkha. And we'll find out, if you look into Greco-Roman culture, one of the things that does happen is shame is not a noble virtue. It's not, per se, an ethical failment. It's the failment of what other people think. Guilt, at least, could correct your behavior in a more fitting way. Shame is, your sight of those people. And that's the point of keeping convicted criminals from getting work when they're out, is to perpetually shame them, putting them on registers or whatever. It's not helping the problem. It just dehumanizes people. And surprise, surprise, it actually increases the recidivism. At Sparta, victory had been marred by a shocking scandal and bought by the sacrifice of allies. Corinth had to acquiesce in the presence of Athenian allies, and now Pactas, on her main trade route. Euboea and Aegina were back under the yoke. For Athens it was a defeat, though thanks to Pericles, not disaster. The tough bargaining of Callias and Endokides had kept Aegina, and Naupactus, though not Troezen and Achaia. Well, though some people, these places would be a good springboard for another time. If Athenian sea power could penetrate the west as Athenian trade had long been doing, the Peloponnese might be caught in a nutcracker grip. Some good modern authorities believe that Pericles was among these, and that the Athens-Sparta dualism, which was the new treaty consecrated, was an anathema to him. But for this, the present writer can see little evidence. It is not often that a politician, even a Pericles, can foresee the long-term consequences of his acts, as they can be seen long after. I'm not sure about that. I think the real problem is they do see it, but I gotta maintain my position. Politics becomes a power play rather than citizenship action. We have no evidence that Pericles dreamed of a political unification of Greece, an idea that would have seemed monstrous to most of his contemporaries. The primacy of Athens in Greece was something quite different, no dream, but already a reality. As to the Drang nach Westen, Plutarch's evidence, for what it's worth, is that Pericles viewed it without enthusiasm as offering awkward commitments and potential dangers. What really and most deeply interested him is that there is ample evidence. Was the building program. We certainly need to build up, we need to focus on our infrastructure. We have some very bad roads in this country. Among the few groups with real cause for enthusiasm over this denouement were the Theban aristocrats, who had recovered control of their city and the leadership in Boeotia. For we have a poem by Theban, now an aged Pindar, for a victory won in 446 by a boy wrestler of Aegina. In it, he salutes for the last time the island city that he had hymned so often and loved so well. Let others deal in power and violence, he says, like the giants that Athena tamed of old. Like Athens, he seems to hint. In Aegina there is justice and righteousness, the honor of ancient heroes, and the gleam from heaven that sheds a radiance of peace over the shortness and frailty of human happiness. There is even the hope of freedom. Did not a clause in the treaty guarantee Aegina home rule? But alas, the reality was to be a sad disappointment after the poet's hope. The whole poem, the 8th Pythian ode, is like a swan song of the older Greece world. As Wade Gary says, which Athens meant to break and build again, but which, as it was broken and remained so. And so we see how, whether our strengths or weaknesses projected as personifications of divinity, if we're going to reject it in pre-Christian cultures, why can't we reject it in Christian cultures and how they deal with Jesus and the saints? Nor was Athens herself unscathed, once more as in the Egyptian disaster. Though on a less disastrous scale, something irreplaceable had perished with Ptolemades and Cleinias and their young men. The defeat of Ptolemades was a blow to the center party that the Green Earth School among the imperialists, whose lineage went back to Cimon, and Aristides, with the loss of the land empire. The predominant importance of the navy was accentuated, and from this time forth the quality and morale of the Athenian army slightly but definitely declined. All the more stark was the antithesis between the radical imperialist, the nautical rabble, as the conservatives called them, and the anti-imperialist under Thucydides. Some more of the year had gone. In Pericles' metaphor, what remains is the garnering, under Pericles himself, of a wonderful harvest, but no second spring. And part 3 will be the Pericles and Athens. And regardless of what you can say about some of these systems, one of the important things that we should probably be looking at is the importance of a law system. The importance of a law system that's not just, popular, popular whatever. Oral tradition is important, just as written tradition is important. But popular vote shouldn't be, oh, well, okay, we're going to execute this guy and this other guy for a far lesser offense, for a far greater offense. Let's just fine him or verbally reprimand him. Yeah, that's what we're going to do. So a set system of law is an important factor in keeping the peace, because you can definitely see how people would revolt of, again, certain stuff. But I'm surprised that that hasn't happened in this country for the sake of incidences like that to a lesser degree. Well, not necessarily lesser degree, but in a different way sometimes.